My foreman fired me for questioning his dangerous shortcut on the gondola cable. Cable techs don't question engineers, he sneered. Hours later, that same cable snapped, stranding 40 people over a frozen canyon. His arrogance got him fired, but my testimony to the federal investigators ensured he would never work in this industry, or any other, ever again. His downfall began with my simple, honest report. The dawn of October 12th was cold, but it was a clean, familiar cold. The kind that promised a good day of work on Blackwood Peak. At 48, I had spent over 2 decades working with ropeways, and the mountain air was more familiar to me than the conditioned air of any office. My name is Lena Petrova, and my hands, calloused and sure, were the only ones at the resort certified for Level 3 ropeway maintenance. That meant I was responsible for the very steel arteries that pumped life and money up the mountain. That morning, the new haul rope for the main gondola lay coiled on massive wooden spools in the maintenance bay, looking like a colossal sleeping serpent. It had arrived the day before, a multi-million-dollar investment from the resort's owner, Mr. Harrison. Our new foreman, Dylan Perez, had fast-tracked the delivery, eager to make his mark. My unease began the moment I laid my gloves on it. The specifications sheet Dylan had proudly pinned to the wall listed a specific European manufacturer, a brand known for its uncompromising quality. Their ropes had a particular feel, a dense, unyielding weight and a tight, uniform weave. This was different. I ran my gloved hand over the surface. The outer wires felt slightly thinner than they should have. I pressed my thumb into a groove, it felt shallower. The galvanization, the protective zinc coating that fights off rust and wear, didn't have the dull, robust sheen I was used to. It had a cheaper, almost tinny brightness. "Frank, come put your hands on this," I called over to Frank Miller, a grizzled maintenance vet who had been on this mountain even longer than I had. He shuffled over, wiping grease from his hands onto a red rag. He was a man of few words, but his eyes missed nothing. He mimicked my action, running his bare, leathery palm along the cable. He grunted, then looked from the cable to me, his brow furrowed. "Feels light," he mumbled, his voice a low rumble. "Exactly," I said, my stomach tightening. "And look at the lay of the strands. It's not as tight as the spec sheet claims. This isn't the German rope we always use." Frank glanced nervously toward the small office where Dylan was on the phone, laughing loudly. Dylan Perez, barely 30, was a fresh-faced engineer with a degree from a prestigious university and 0 practical field experience. He was also Mr. Harrison's nephew-in-law, a fact that seemed to fuel his unearned confidence. He saw our weathered experience not as an asset, but as an obstacle to his modern way of doing things. "The invoice says it is," Frank said, taking a step back from the spool. "Perez signed off on it himself yesterday, said he inspected it on the truck." An inspection on a truck is a glance, not an analysis. You can't feel the temper of the steel or the integrity of the core from 10 feet away. I walked to the end of the cable and examined the factory-sealed tip. There was no manufacturer's stamp. Every certified ropeway cable I had ever installed had a stamp, a mark of pride and a seal of safety. This rope didn't have one. "He's not gonna listen, Lena," Frank warned, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know how he is. Thinks that piece of paper on his wall makes him a god." "He might be a god in his own mind, Frank," I replied, my own voice hardening as I pulled the resort's logbook from its shelf. "But up on that line, physics is the only god that matters. And physics says this rope is a lie." I clicked my pen, the sound echoing in the cavernous bay. I was going to document my concerns. It was my duty. I had no idea that simple, responsible act was about to cost me my job. At 7:15 a.m., I walked into Dylan Perez's shoebox office. The walls were covered not with technical schematics or safety protocols, but with framed photos of him and his wife, Cynthia, on lavish vacations. A brand new white hard hat without a single scratch sat pristine on the corner of his desk. He was leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, a smug half-smile on his face. He didn't look up when I entered. "What is it, Lena?" "I'm in the middle of a crucial procurement analysis," he said, the term sounding absurdly corporate for a ski resort. I placed the open logbook on his desk, right next to a porcelain mug that read World's Best Engineer. I pointed to my neat, block-lettered entry. Dylan, I have serious concerns about the new haul rope. I've logged them here. It doesn't match the material specs on the purchase order. The wire diameter feels substandard, the galvanization is suspect, and there's no manufacturer's stamp on the tip. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning my entry with open disdain. He took a deliberate, slow sip from his mug before setting it down with a soft click. Lena, he began, his tone dripping with condescension, I have a 4-year degree in mechanical engineering from one of the top programs in the country. I personally reviewed the technical data sheets and approved this delivery. The rope meets all necessary tensile strength requirements on paper. Paper doesn't pull 40 people up a mountain, Dylan. The rope does, I countered, keeping my voice level. I'm the only level 3 certified ropeway tech on this mountain. My certification requires me to physically verify and approve any critical load-bearing component. I cannot and will not sign off on installing this cable. A flash of anger sparked in his eyes. He stood up, puffing out his chest. He was trying to use his height to intimidate me, a classic power move. From the main bay, I could see Sophie, the young gondola operator, and Frank pretending not to watch the drama unfolding through the office window. Your job isn't to approve or deny, he said, his voice rising. Your job is to follow the installation plan that I designed. You are a technician, a mechanic, you follow orders. My job is to ensure safety, I stated firmly. My signature goes on the final inspection report. If something goes wrong, my certification is on the line. My name is on the line. I'm telling you, as the most experienced person here, that this rope is a red flag. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He picked up my logbook and tore out the page I had just written on, crumpling it in his fist. You know what this is? This is insubordination. You're trying to undermine my authority because you're a dinosaur who can't handle new methods. He leaned across the desk, his face inches from mine. Let me make this crystal clear. At Blackwood Peak, cable techs don't question engineers. You will either go out there and lead the installation crew, or you can pack your tools. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a disagreement, it was a threat. All my years of service, my perfect safety record, my deep instinctual knowledge of this machinery, he was dismissing it all with a single, arrogant wave of his hand. I stood my ground. Then I guess I'm packing my tools. Fine, he snapped, his face turning red. You're fired. Get your personal items and get off this mountain. Security will escort you out. He jabbed a finger toward the door. You're done, Petrova. I turned without another word and walked out of his office. I could feel the shocked stares of Sophie and Frank on my back. I didn't look at them. I kept my head held high as I walked to my locker, the crumpled ball of my official warning lying on Dylan's floor like a discarded prophecy. My small cabin is nestled in the woods about 5 miles down the road from the resort, just far enough to feel separate, but close enough that the mountain's peak is always visible from my kitchen window. The afternoon of my firing was a blur of quiet, seething rage. I spent hours methodically cleaning and oiling my tools, the familiar weight and smell of steel and solvent a small comfort. Each turn of the wrench, each wipe of the cloth, was a way of processing the raw injustice. I had given 22 years to that mountain. I had canceled vacations, worked through blizzards, and treated every bolt and gear as if my own life depended on it. By 3:30 p.m., the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a heavy, hollow feeling. I was sitting at my small wooden table, laptop open, scrolling through job listings in other states. The idea of leaving my home was sickening, but staying felt impossible. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a local station. The headline was a punch to the gut. Gondola malfunction, AT Blackwood Peak, DOZNS stranded. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat, a cold, metallic dread instantly replacing the anger. I knew with absolute, gut-wrenching certainty what malfunction meant. I scrambled to pick up the phone and clicked the link. A live helicopter feed filled the screen. The image was surreal, a nightmare brought to life. The gondola cars, usually marching in a neat, orderly procession up the mountain, were stopped dead. One car dangled at a sickeningly sharp angle, swinging wildly in the wind. Below it, the haul rope, the brand-new substandard haul rope, was not just damaged. It had snapped. A thick steel cable as thick as my arm had parted like a piece of thread, its frayed end glinting uselessly in the afternoon sun. My mind raced. 40 people. The news report said 40 people were trapped. Families on vacation, skiers chasing the last run of the day, resort employees. I saw the faces of the people I greeted every morning. Sophie, the operator, was she working today? My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned on the television, and the scene was even more terrifying on a larger screen. Anchors with grim faces were talking about a catastrophic failure. They showed rescue helicopters hovering precariously near the dangling cabins, trying to execute high-risk mid-air evacuations in the increasingly gusty winds. The temperature on the mountain was dropping fast. There was no satisfaction. No, I told you so. There was only a profound, bottomless horror. I had been right, but being right felt like a curse. My warning, crumpled and discarded on Dylan's office floor, was now a specter haunting that mountainside. Those 40 people, suspended between the sky and the unforgiving rocks of the canyon below, were living proof of his hubris. My phone began to ring, the name Frank Miller flashing on the screen. I stared at it, my hand trembling too much to answer. What could I even say? The snap of that cable was an echo of Dylan's sneering voice. Cable techs don't question engineers. That echo was now a scream, and the whole world was about to hear it. The phone call from Frank had been short and frantic. Lena, it snapped. The new rope. It came apart. You were right. Oh heavens, you were right. His voice was choked with panic, and I suspected a healthy dose of guilt. I couldn't find the words to respond. I just listened to the television, where the anchors were using words like unprecedented and harrowing. I felt a strange and terrible disconnect, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life, someone else's mountain. The rescue operation lasted into the night. I watched glued to the screen as the final person was winched into a helicopter just before 9:00 p.m. All 40 were accounted for. Hypothermia, shock, terror, but alive. The relief was so immense it brought me to my knees. Only then did the tears come, a hot flood of anger, fear, and exhaustion. I must have dozed off in the armchair because the next thing I knew, the pale morning light was filtering through the pines, and there was a sharp, insistent knocking on my front door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was official, devoid of any warmth. My heart leaped into my throat. Was it resort security, sent by Dylan to harass me further? The local sheriff, delivering some kind of gag order. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open. Standing on my porch were a man and a woman, neither of whom I recognized. They were dressed in dark, practical suits that looked out of place against the rustic backdrop of my cabin. They held no clipboards, just a quiet, intense air of authority. The man, who looked to be in his late 40s with sharp eyes and a stern set to his jaw, stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, my name is Agent Ramirez," he said, his voice calm and even. He held up a badge. "I'm with the National Transportation Safety Board. This is my colleague, Agent Evans. Are you Lena Petrova?" The NTSB, Federal Investigators. The weight of those 4 letters settled in the air between us. This was no longer a resort matter. This was a national incident. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm Lena." Agent Ramirez nodded slowly, his eyes seeming to take in every detail of my face, my home, the very air around me. "We're here about the catastrophic failure of the main gondola lift at Blackwood Peak yesterday," he continued, his tone giving nothing away. "We understand you were the lead ropeway technician there, until yesterday morning. We'd like to ask you a few questions." I stepped aside and motioned them in. My small cabin suddenly felt cluttered and inadequate under their professional gaze. They declined my offer of coffee, instead taking seats at the small wooden table where my laptop still lay open to a page of out-of-state job listings. Agent Ramirez sat opposite me, placing a small digital recorder on the table. Agent Evans sat slightly to the side, a notebook open, her pen poised. The silence was heavy. "Ms. Petrova," Ramirez began, "we are conducting a full investigation into the events of yesterday. Our mandate is to find the cause, not to lay blame. We need a clear, factual picture of the situation. Can you help us with that?" I was still reeling, unsure of my role. Was I a witness, a person of interest, a convenient scapegoat? "I'm not sure how I can help. As you know, I was terminated." Ramirez's gaze was unwavering. "We know. We have a copy of your termination report, filed by Foreman Dylan Perez at 7:38 a.m. yesterday. It cites insubordination and refusal to perform assigned duties. We also have the maintenance bay's official daily logbook." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It's a curious document. The entry for October 12th has been torn out. Do you know anything about that?" That was it, the moment of truth. They knew. They had already seen the hole in Dylan's story. This wasn't a trap, it was an invitation to tell the truth. A wave of clarity washed over me. "Yes," I said, my voice suddenly strong and clear. "I know everything about that, because I wrote the entry that was on that page." For the next hour, I talked. I told them everything, starting with the moment I laid my hands on the new cable. I described the substandard feel, the shallow grooves, the lack of a manufacturer's stamp. I recounted my conversation with Frank Miller. I detailed my formal entry into the logbook, quoting my own words as best I could remember them. "Significant safety concerns regarding new haul rope. Material does not appear to meet PO specifications. Recommend immediate third-party analysis before installation. Cannot certify." Then I told them about the meeting in Dylan's office. I didn't embellish or add emotion. I gave them the facts, the words, the tone. I told them how he'd dismissed my 2 decades of experience, how he'd crumpled up my official warning, how he'd sneered, "Cable techs don't question engineers," and how he had fired me on the spot for refusing to install a rope I knew was a danger to the public. Agent Evans's pen flew across her notebook. Agent Ramirez just listened, his expression unreadable, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, the silence returned, but this time it felt different. It was filled with the weight of my testimony. "Thank you, Ms. Petrova," Ramirez said finally, switching off the recorder. "You've been very helpful. We will need you to provide a formal, written statement. We will also be interviewing everyone on the maintenance staff, including Mr. Miller." He handed me his card. "If you remember anything else, or if anyone from the resort attempts to contact you, I want you to call me directly." As they left, I felt the first glimmer of something other than horror and rage. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but I recognized it: hope. The 2 days following the investigators' visit were a strange limbo. Blackwood Peak was officially closed, yellow tape cordoning off the entrance like a crime scene. The news channels had moved on to the next disaster, but the mountain community was buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. My phone, which had been silent, began to chime with tentative text messages. The first was from Sophie, the young gondola operator. "Lena, are you okay? Things are crazy up here. They're telling everyone you were fired for being reckless." My fingers tightened on the phone. Of course. The disgruntled employee narrative. It was predictable and cowardly. I typed back. "I'm fine, Sophie. Don't believe anything they say. Did you speak to the investigators?" Her reply came instantly. "Yes." I told them what I saw. I told them I saw Dylan tear the page out of the book. I was scared, but I did it. A surge of pride and gratitude washed over me. That young woman had more courage than most men twice her age. Her eyewitness account was crucial. My next call was harder. I dialed Frank Miller. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice low and shaky. "Lena, I can't talk." "Frank, you have to," I urged, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "Ramirez and the NTSB are going to interview you. They are not Dylan Perez. They are not Mr. Harrison. They want the truth. You held that rope, Frank. You know I was right." There was a long, agonized silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his shallow breathing, the sound of a man wrestling with his conscience and his fear. "They're saying you're trying to sue the resort for wrongful dismissal," he whispered, "that this is all about money for you." "Is that what you think, Frank?" I asked quietly. Another pause. "No," he admitted, his voice cracking. "No, I know better, but my pension, I'm 3 years out, Lena. I can't lose my job." 40 people almost lost their lives, I shot back, my patience fraying. "Your pension is worthless if you can't look yourself in the mirror every morning. Just tell them what you saw. Tell them what you felt when you touched that cable. The truth has a way of protecting itself, and it will protect you." I hung up, not knowing if I had gotten through to him. The resort's management, led by Dylan and his influential wife, Cynthia, were circling the wagons. Sophie's texts painted a grim picture. Cynthia had been overheard in the lodge loudly complaining about the shoddy local workforce and how Dylan was a hero for discovering my supposed incompetence before I could do real damage. They were building a fortress of lies, and right now, my only weapons were my testimony and the wavering courage of a few good people. The whispers on the mountain were a storm gathering, and I was standing right in its eye. 2 weeks after the incident, Agent Ramirez called me. "Ms. Petrova," he said, his tone as crisp as an autumn morning, "we've executed a warrant and secured the resort's financial records and all of Mr. Perez's work computers. There are some things I'd like you to see. Could you come down to the temporary field office we've set up in town?" The field office was a bland, rented space above the post office, smelling of stale coffee and industrial-grade carpeting. Ramirez led me to a conference room where printouts were spread across a long table like a paper autopsy. "Dylan Perez was very good at creating a story," Ramirez began, pointing to a stack of documents. "This is the official purchase order he submitted to the resort's accounting department for the new hall rope. As you can see, it's from Muller Stahlsale, the German company you mentioned. The price, $2.3 million. It's all very convincing." He then slid a second document next to the first. It was a different invoice, printed on thinner, cheaper-looking paper. The company name at the top was one I had never heard of, with an address in a city I couldn't pronounce. The specifications were listed in poorly translated English. "This," Ramirez said, tapping the second invoice, "was found in a hidden subfolder on Dylan's hard drive. It's the actual purchase order for the rope that was installed. Notice the price." I leaned in. My eyes scanned past the unfamiliar letterhead and found the number at the bottom, $900,000. A $1.4 million difference, I breathed, the scale of the deception hitting me like a physical blow. This wasn't just arrogance or negligence. This was criminal fraud. "Exactly," Ramirez confirmed. He doctored the invoice for Mr. Harrison, ordering a cheap, uncertified cable while billing the resort for the best on the market. We're still tracing the funds, but our forensic accountants are fairly certain that 7-figure difference didn't just vanish into thin air. It went somewhere. He pointed to a column of technical data on the counterfeit rope spec sheet. "Does this mean anything to you?" My eyes, trained by years of experience, scanned the numbers. Tensile strength, load capacity, fatigue rating. They were all just numbers on a page, but I knew what they really meant. "They're plausible," I said slowly. "If you've never actually worked with the real thing, it's like a cheap imitation of a luxury watch. It tells time, but you wouldn't trust it in a dive. This rope, it might test okay in a sterile lab environment once. But under the dynamic stresses of a fully operational gondola, the constant tension, the friction, the temperature shifts, it was guaranteed to fail. The metal fatigue would accelerate at an exponential rate." I looked up at Ramirez, my voice shaking with a cold fury. He didn't just cut a corner. He took the 40 most valuable safety components out of the system and replaced them with garbage to line his pockets. He put a price tag on 40 human lives, and that price was $1.4 million. Ramirez simply nodded, his jaw tight. The paper trail didn't just tell a story of a lie, it was a signed confession. The official inquiry was held a month later in a sterile county courthouse conference room. It felt less like a courtroom and more like a stage for a slow-motion execution. On one side sat Dylan Perez, his wife Cynthia, and a high-priced lawyer. Dylan looked pale and thin, the arrogant swagger replaced by a twitchy, hunted look. Cynthia, however, radiated icy defiance, her designer handbag placed on the table like a shield. On the other side sat Mr. Harrison, who looked a decade older, his face a mask of grief and bewilderment. I sat with Agent Ramirez, my role now solidified as the state's key witness. My testimony came first. Guided by Ramirez's questions, I calmly and factually recounted my experience, my qualifications, my warnings, and my termination. I presented my knowledge not as opinion, but as professional expertise. The defense lawyer tried to paint me as a disgruntled, aging employee resentful of a younger, more educated boss. "Isn't it true, Ms. Petrova," he asked patronizingly, "that you simply felt threatened by Mr. Perez's modern, data-driven approach?" "A data-driven approach is only as good as the data you put in," I replied calmly. "Mr. Perez put in fraudulent data. My approach is driven by something else. 22 years of ensuring people get to the top of the mountain and back down again safely. My record on that is perfect." The lawyer had no follow-up. Sophie was next. The young operator, visibly nervous but resolute, confirmed she saw Dylan tear the page from the logbook. Cynthia stared daggers at her, but Sophie never looked away from the inquiry panel. Then they called Frank Miller. My heart pounded. This was the moment. Frank shuffled to the witness chair, refusing to meet my eyes or Dylan's. He looked small and terrified. "Mr. Miller," the lead investigator asked, "did Ms. Petrova show you the new hall rope on the morning of October 12th? Frank swallowed hard. He looked at his worn hands, twisting in his lap. "Yes," he mumbled. "And what was your professional opinion of that rope?" Silence. The air in the room was thick enough to chew. I saw Dylan lean forward, a predatory glint in his eye. Frank took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked up, first at Mr. Harrison, then at me. His eyes were full of apology and a newfound resolve. "It felt wrong," Frank said, his voice suddenly clear and strong. "It felt light. Cheap. Lena said it wasn't right, and she's never been wrong about the lines. Not once in 20 years. I told her Perez wouldn't listen. She logged it anyway. She did her job the right way." A collective gasp went through the room. It was over. Dylan Perez slumped in his chair as if his own strings had been cut. The fortress of lies had just been brought down by one honest man who decided his conscience was worth more than his pension. The unraveling was swift and brutal. Frank's testimony had cracked the foundation, and now Agent Ramirez moved in to bring the whole rotten structure down. He stood and directed the panel's attention to a large screen. "We have heard testimony about professional opinions and visual inspections," he announced. "Now let's look at the facts." The first image that flashed on the screen was the pristine, professional invoice from the German manufacturer, Muller Stahlsale, for $2.3 million. "This is what Mr. Perez submitted to Blackwood Peak's accounting department," Ramirez said. He clicked a button. The image was replaced by the second invoice, the one from the obscure overseas supplier, with its poor grammar and a total of $900,000. "And this is the invoice from the company that actually supplied the cable." He wasn't done. The next image was a series of bank transfers. "We traced the $1.4 million discrepancy," Ramirez continued, his voice cold as ice. "Mr. Perez created a shell corporation, a consulting firm based out of a P.O. box. The resort paid the German supplier's agent, which was his shell company. He then used that company to pay the $900,000 to the real supplier and funneled the remaining $1.4 million directly into a personal offshore account." Cynthia gasped audibly. Her face had gone from icy defiance to a blotchy, waxen mask of horror. She stared at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. Dylan leaped to his feet. "This is a lie, a frame-up. She put them up to this." He shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That old hag couldn't stand that I was smarter than her. She sabotaged the rope." The outburst was so unhinged, so pathetic, that it only served to cement his guilt. His own lawyer put a hand on his arm, trying to pull him back into his seat, but he shook it off. I have an engineering degree. He yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. I'm the victim here. Mr. Harrison, who had been sitting like a stone statue, finally moved. He rose slowly to his feet, his ancient frame trembling with a quiet, terrible rage. He looked directly at his niece's husband. You disgraced my family, he said, his voice raspy but carrying across the silent room. You put 40 innocent people in mortal danger. You betrayed my trust, and you did it for money. He looked from Dylan to his niece, Cynthia. Get out of my sight, both of you. Dylan Perez finally crumpled into his chair, a broken man. The smug engineer was gone, replaced by a common thief who had gambled with human lives and lost. The unraveling was complete. All that was left was the wreckage. The official inquiry concluded, but the true demolition of Dylan Perez's life had just begun. The NTSB's findings were immediately handed over to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges were filed, 40 counts of reckless endangerment, one for every person left dangling over that canyon, felony fraud, and grand larceny. Dylan's high-priced lawyer was replaced by a court-appointed defender who looked perpetually exhausted. The social fallout was just as devastating. Cynthia, who had built her identity around being Mrs. Perez, the brilliant engineer's wife and niece of the resort magnate, was suddenly a pariah. The local papers ran stories with headlines like Blackwood Betrayal and Greed on the Gondola. Every time she went to the grocery store or the local cafe, she was met with cold stares and pointed whispers. Her empire, built on her husband's lies and her uncle's money, had crumbled overnight. One afternoon, about a month after the inquiry, I was in town picking up supplies when I saw her. Cynthia was sitting alone at an outdoor table at a cafe, staring into a cup of coffee. She was wearing sunglasses, but they couldn't hide the tension in her jaw. On impulse, I walked over to her table. She looked up, startled, and her face hardened when she saw it was me. What do you want? She spat, her voice a low, venomous hiss. Come to gloat. No, I said simply, taking the seat opposite her. I came to understand. She let out a harsh, barking laugh. Understand what? That my life is ruined, that my husband is going to prison, that my own family won't speak to me. Congratulations, you got your revenge. This was never about revenge, Cynthia, I said, my voice soft but firm. This was about a steel cable. It was about 40 people who trusted that the person in charge knew what they were doing. Your husband didn't just lie about a purchase order. He lied about who he was. And you believed it. You enjoyed the benefits of it. I leaned forward. Did you ever once ask him about his work? Not about the promotions or the bonuses, but about the actual work. The responsibility of it. Or was it just easier to enjoy the new car and the expensive vacations and not ask any difficult questions? Her face crumpled. The sunglasses came off, and I saw her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. The icy facade had finally melted, revealing a woman lost in the wreckage of a life she hadn't realized was built on a lie. I didn't know, she whispered, the words sounding hollow. I swear I didn't know the details. Maybe not, I conceded. But you knew he was arrogant. You saw how he treated people like me and Frank. You dismissed us as shoddy local workers. You enabled his pride, Cynthia. You polished it. You built your empire on it. And when pride is the foundation, the whole thing is bound to collapse. I stood up, leaving my own coffee untouched. He's not the only one who has to live with the consequences, I said, leaving her to stare at her own reflection in the dark, bitter coffee. The legal and financial fallout rained down on Blackwood Peak like an avalanche. The resort was buried in lawsuits from the rescued passengers. Insurance rates skyrocketed to astronomical levels. The NTSB's final report was a damning indictment of the resort's management culture, citing a willful disregard for established safety protocols and a failure to empower experienced personnel. Dylan Perez, facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence, took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 10 years in state prison. Mr. Harrison, heartbroken and humbled, did the only thing he could. He reached out to me. His lawyers called mine. I had to get a lawyer to handle the deluge of media requests and settlement offers, and a meeting was arranged. We met not in a sterile office, but at a small diner halfway between the mountain and my cabin. He looked frail, the weight of the disaster having stooped his once proud shoulders. "Lena," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "no amount of money can fix what my family has done. Sorry is a word that doesn't feel big enough." "It's not," I agreed, taking a sip of water. He nodded, accepting the truth of it. "The resort is filing for bankruptcy protection. I'm selling it. But before I do, I need to make things right with you. My lawyers have drawn up a settlement for the wrongful termination, the defamation, the emotional distress. It's a significant number." He pushed an envelope across the table. I didn't open it. "That's not what I want, Mr. Harrison," I said quietly. He looked confused, but my lawyer said, "I don't want your money as a settlement," I clarified. "Not in the way you think. The investigation, the lawsuits, they've brought the value of Blackwood down to almost nothing. But the mountain is still there, the slopes are still there, the potential is still there." I looked him directly in the eye. "Across the valley is the old Grizzly Ridge Resort. It's been defunct for 5 years, but the land is prime and the permits are still active. It's for sale." A flicker of understanding lit his tired eyes. "I want the money from the settlement," I continued, "but I want it structured as a loan, an investment, and I want Blackwood's heavy machinery, the snowcats, the lifts that are still salvageable, the workshop tools, as collateral. I'm going to buy Grizzly Ridge. I'm going to build a new resort, one that's built on safety and respect, not pride and fraud." Mr. Harrison was speechless. He stared at me, then a slow, small smile touched his lips for the first time. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. "You are an incredible woman, Lena Petrova," he said. "The deal is done." 1 year later, I stood on the unfinished deck of a brand-new mountain lodge. The air was crisp with the promise of first snow, and the smell of fresh-cut pine hung in the air. Below me, the valley stretched out, a tapestry of autumn colors. Directly across from me, the silent, skeletal towers of the old Blackwood Peak Gondola stood like a monument to arrogance. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my own mountain. Welcome to Petrova's Point. The life twist had been realizing that the settlement wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The money, combined with a hefty investment from a consortium of the very passengers whose lives had been endangered, a fact that brought me grim satisfaction, had allowed me to do the impossible. I had bought my own mountain. Frank Miller was my new head of mountain operations, his pension now more secure than ever. Sophie was training to be his deputy. We had built a smaller, smarter, better resort from the ground up. As I stood there, soaking in the view, my phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Dylan Perez had been denied his first parole hearing. I felt nothing. No joy, no anger. He was just a ghost from another life. My focus was on the future, on the families who would soon be skiing these slopes, trusting us to keep them safe.